for tonight, we're going to be considering C.S. Lewis's book, Miracles, and we're going to be doing so under the able guidance of José María Yulo, who is there with us on the screen. You can see he's got a beautiful gilt-framed painting in the background. Say hello to everybody, Jose.
Very nice to see everybody.
Well, we're grateful to have Jose on our board of directors. He is a research fellow at the Independent Institute, and also he teaches philosophy and Western civilization at the Academy of Art University in San Francisco. He has quite a number of interesting degrees that he has earned. He's written on Platonic influences on Tolkien, and his articles have appeared in various journals. We're so thankful to have you with us tonight. And I believe that we will be blessed with seeing a number of visual presentations in the course of his discussion tonight. But if you don't mind, I want to begin with a brief word of prayer, asking for God's blessing on our discussion and on Jose. Pray in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Thank you, God, for giving us the mercy of being together to consider your truth and the world that you have created and the mysteries thereof. Guide Jose as he leads us in this discussion. Lead us into wisdom and truth. For Christ's name, amen. Okay, it's all yours, Jose.
Well, it's very nice to see all of you again and present on Lewis's Miracles. I have to admit, when I was reading Miracles to prepare for this presentation, I found it a rather challenging book to read. I did Mere Christianity last year, and Mere Christianity is, when you read a Lewis book, especially his philosophical books, Mere Christianity is written like a professor. Lewis is writing as a professor, explaining to you what Christianity is, what stands in opposition to Christianity, what is the main Christian virtue. Well, humility is one of them. However, with Miracles, I found myself thinking that Lewis is in a way taking a different approach. There is one word I'd like you to hang on throughout this presentation and the next presentation in 2 weeks, and that is hope. It's an interesting sort of concept to think about with regards to the virtues. It's one of the 3 Christian virtues, of course, but I found this to be very prevalent all throughout the reading of Miracles. It's almost as if Lewis is writing this, yes, in a professorial way, but writing this in a manner where you're not really finding the breadcrumbs and getting to the end point as easily as perhaps, I don't want to say easily, but as perhaps as readily as you find it in Mere Christianity. With Miracles, you have to wait a little bit. And I think he takes a Chestertonian approach, almost a Socratic approach, to the elimination of things that don't make any sense, which leaves you, of course, with the possibility of accepting something that is left after this rigorous back and forth of questioning. Okay, so we'll be doing Miracles tonight. My mode of presentation, as per how I've always done this for the Great Lewis Society, is I'll be sharing visuals with you and trying to give extra context and flavor, perhaps, to the readings we have from Miracles. I borrow this from a mentor of mine, an old family friend and mentor from the Philippines, Father James Donnellan. He was an American Jesuit priest who lived throughout World War II and the following decades in the Philippines. He ended up being the president of the Jesuit University in the Philippines, Ateneo de Manila. Very close family friend of my folks and myself. He was also an English lit scholar at Oxford University in his younger days. He used to do something called the Grand Tour, which I've kind of adopted a little bit for my own usage. The Grand Tour, according to him, it was back in those days, of course, in the 70s and 80s, there wasn't a lot of high tech. So he would show you a slideshow of various pictures taken from his travels through Europe. So if he was in the morning on a piazza in Florence one day, showing you a sculpture in Venice the other day, and then he would explain to you what went into the production of this work of art. Not only that, he would then explain what was the philosophy of the time period. How did people think during that time period? What were the current events? What wars happened during that time period, which influenced the making of this wonderful work of art you're seeing? I've really found this method of presentation to be a very well-rounded, three-dimensional way of presenting information. And I hope to use this, of course, to complement Lewis's text. Of course, not taking anything away from the profundity of Lewis's text, but rather adding a different element so perhaps you could see things in a different light. Okay, so we'll begin with a sort of an outline of how this presentation will go. There are four main blocks of the presentation with a break in between. The first of these will be Lewis is presenting, so again, number one, or Roman numeral one, however you'd like to think of it. The first of these is Lewis is presenting an intellectual dilemma of sorts that is found when he compares two kinds of people with how they regard miracles. He calls these supernaturalists those who are open to the possibility of miracles, and those who are called naturalists. Meaning, according in Lewis's definition, those who are not disposed to accepting the possibility of miracles. So he presents a dilemma, an intellectual dilemma happening with the first part, our first block today. The second part, a second part of the presentation is Lewis then presents something kind of interesting. He says that naturalists are not often given, are not, when you think about them, are not given to having a faith themselves or being predisposed to religion. But he then speculates, what if they did have one? So the possibility of a naturalism-based religion will be block number two. For block number three, following from the naturalist-based religion, Lewis will then go on to describe how a moral system or an ethical system is developed within the framework of a naturalist system versus a supernaturalist system. So we'll be looking at ethics and morals a little bit, comparing those two kinds of ways of thinking with regards to supernaturalists and naturalists. And finally, for part four, our last part today, Lewis will give us a working definition of what a miracle is. Again, it's not like mere Christianity, right? Where we follow the breadcrumbs and things iron out very, 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 very readily. With Lewis, you have to sort of leave yourself open. Leave yourself open to thinking in ways that you perhaps had not done before. I found myself doing this all through the reading of the text. Okay, so those are the four main blocks for today. We'll be beginning by reading text from the book. This is my copy, my edition right here. I'll be saying what the page numbers are. I'll be reading those aloud and then discussing them with our visuals for today. You may find me every now and then asking a Socratic question. I almost can't help myself, by the way, by this, because I have DNA from St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland. That's my academic and intellectual DNA, where from day one we were weaned on the Socratic method, basically trying to learn through asking questions. And it may come in handy in this presentation. Okay, so for this first part of the presentation, I'd like to take your attention to pages 8 and 9 of the text. And there are two quotes I'd like to focus on. The first is on page 8. If you have a copy of the text, this particular quote begins about 60% down the page on page 8. It begins with the phrase, thus no thoroughgoing. Thus no thoroughgoing. If you guys have the text in front of you, make sure we're all on the same page.
Yeah.
Okay. With regards to this first quote, thus no thoroughgoing naturalist believes in free will. For free will would mean that human beings have the power of independent action, the power of doing something more or other than what was involved by the total series of events. And any such separate power of originating events is what the naturalist denies. Spontaneity, originality, action on its own is a privilege reserved for the whole show, which he calls nature. That is the first quote. Let me read you one that sort of works its way into it, almost like a dance, on the second page, on page 9 of this joint quote. This begins with the first full paragraph on page 9. The phrase is the difference between. The difference between. The difference between the two views might be expressed by saying that naturalism gives us a democratic, supernaturalism, a monarchical picture of reality. The naturalist thinks that the privilege of being on its own resides in the total mass of things. Just as in a democracy, sovereignty resides in the whole mass of the people. The supernaturalist thinks that this privilege belongs to some other things, or, more probably, one thing, and not to others. just as in a real monarchy, the king has sovereignty and the people do not. And just as in a democracy, all citizens are equal. So for the naturalist, one thing or event is as good as another, in the sense that they are all equally dependent on the natural system of things. According to Lewis, the naturalist, as opposed to the supernaturalist, believes in what's called a vast process in space and time, which is going on of its own accord. Perhaps we can call this nature. This would mean that naturalists would not be disposed to believe in miracles, because miracles for the naturalist would exist outside of this vast process of space and time, self-contained, pretty much hermetically sealed, nothing else coming from the outside into it. It is therefore curious to see here a disavowal of free will, acting on one's own accord, due to spontaneity being reserved for the process, for nature. This took me, when I was reading this, as, dare I say, a bit elitist, in a sense where you are trying to remove something transcendental. Yes, in Lewis's thinking, we are removing something beyond nature in an effort to, oh, I don't know, allow more of a democratic reign amongst the beings that exist within nature. But at the same time, nature seems to be above those who live within it. I.e., nature is not existing on a democratic, equal, flat, horizontal plane with everybody else in it. Lewis then states that naturalists are more democratic by leaving the individual without the privilege accorded to the group. Supernaturalists hold to exclusivity of one thing having sovereignty and not others. Then the naturalist is undemocratic, ironically, in having all equals on the ground. Again, all things that exist within nature are equal to each other. But the group itself is subservient to the system. So to the naturalists, according to Lewis, it is more democratic than supernaturalism, because supernaturalism implies a being beyond nature, who then has sovereignty over nature. So take that away with naturalism, yes? But even in that system, without a transcendent being, there is still, if you will, a hierarchy. It is not a flat plane. It is not a pure democracy. There is something above, those that live below, beneath, so to speak. In both views, freedom of the individual is undermined even with the claim of naturalism being more democratic than supernaturalism. In both instances, there seems to be an emphasis on, this is how I took it, pushing something down with no intention of lifting it up back again, an imposed dominion of sorts. I will begin a screen share now and show you our first visual for today. This painting is called Young Farmers, or the subtitle of this is Study for Weaning the Calf. It was painted by Winslow Homer, American painter, of course, of the 19th century. He lived from 1836 to 1910. Oil on canvas, it is found at the Portland Art Museum in Portland, Maine. It was painted between 1873 and 1874 with regards to this painting. Well, I took it as a bit of a personal challenge to communicate how supernaturalism can be found in one of the most prominent naturalist painters of the 19th century. That's what, of course, Homer is known for, being the great naturalist American painter. Homer first built a reputation as an illustrator and painter during the American Civil War. A lot of his paintings have a certain nostalgia to them. There is a nostalgia for a pre-Civil War United States, before the great cataclysmic chaos and bloodshed that happened during the Civil War. There is a throwback, if you will, a feel of it being a throwback when you look at a Winslow Homer painting. He was the bridge, if you think about it, that transition. His website online describes him as thus. Winslow Homer is the bridge between the America of Henry David Thoreau to the America of Theodore Roosevelt. he connects one to the other. The early to middle part of the 19th century to the latter part and emergent 20th century, past that point. He was later, of course, known for his rugged seascapes of the state of Maine. He spent the rest of his life there. My wife and I traveled to Maine this summer, and we were very fortunate to see the Portland Art Museum and some wonderful pieces of art from Winslow Homer, and also to see the seascape that inspired Homer to communicate this via painting. Quite beautiful, by the way, if you get the chance. The painting was produced while Homer was living in Gloucester, Massachusetts, which of course is a different state than Maine, but it also harbors the rustic independence that Maine is known for. Gloucester, Massachusetts is a fishing village, by the way, very much a hub of the fishing industry in Massachusetts. There are two boys, of course, and a cow in the painting. Ostensibly, the boys are engaged in farm work, in weaning the calf, so to speak, in performing a chore. If we take into account what Lewis is saying about supernaturalism and naturalism, namely, that naturalism does not leave room for free will. Let's work this through the painting a little bit. One can argue, if you take a naturalist point of view, that the boys are destined to perform this chore. They have no choice in the matter. It's simply a system. They are merely cogs in the system, so to speak. However, the facts of their age, meaning they're quite young, these are not teenagers or adults, they're children, but beginning to act in and of themselves. The fact of their age and lack of supervision that we can see in the painting point to a sense of independence and free will in the boys as you see them in the painting. They are taking up a grown-up responsibility. One thing that spoke to me a little bit is you can't see their shoes. Their feet are essentially entrenched into the ground. This has the sense of, I grew up close to a farm in the Philippines as well. When you get your feet dirty, essentially, when you get your feet on the ground and you're beginning to do chores, you're already involved in the tasks at hand. You're not above essentially getting dirty in doing these tasks. They're already committed to this task. While naturalism touts democracy, one boy, not the other, appears to be setting the course of action. It seems like the shorter boy right here, with his hand, is laying out perhaps a plan. What's going to happen to his partner, to the other boy in the painting. Which the other, of course, has the freedom to agree or disagree with. He can say, well, we're going to do it a certain way or not. Contra the sovereignty of the group, the sovereignty of nature within naturalism that Lewis is talking about. Each of these boys can decide the best way without it being imposed on them by an outside source. They are independent agents taking action in this painting. They are not, of course, although they are involved in a process, they are not being dominated by the process. Some greater thing existing in time and space without anything transcendent, which, of course, again, definition-wise, Lewis calls nature. When you look at Homer's art, Winslow Homer's art, there is an approachable quality to it. This painting took me very much when I saw it at the Portland Art Museum. It was a very frank, earnest. There aren't any airs being put on in this painting. It was a very simple, rather potent shot of rural American life. There is an approachability to Winslow Homer's painting. And I contrast this, by the way, I have used another American 19th century painter in the past, in my presentations in the past, that being John Singer Sargent. Sargent, of course, was a contemporary of Homer. He was the other great American painter of the 19th century. Sargent's work is brilliant. He is perhaps the one you want to hire if you want a beautiful portrait painting made of you. But there is a certain distance with regards to John Singer Sargent. The same thing that made him so talented in conveying dignity in the people he portrayed in paintings. If you ever want to look it up, Singer Sargent's painting of Theodore Roosevelt is one of his more famous paintings, where Roosevelt looks very imposing, almost like a mythic figure that Sargent is conveying. But that same ability to make you look dignified, which Sargent had very much in spades, there were very few people who could match that ability. He didn't exactly have the skill to make his subjects approachable. Winslow Homer does have this gift, if you will, or this skill, in making who he is painting not too distant from us in terms of trying to relate to them, or perhaps even have sympathy for them in that sense. There is an approachability which conveys in this youthful scene, and I would argue there is a sense of hope in this painting. Please note this painting was produced years after the Civil War, after this great cataclysmic event in American history. But here, Homer is hearkening back to an earlier age, where simple acts were done by people, not because of political reasons or sociological reasons, but simply because there were chores to do in a certain day, and they chose to do them. There is an approachability and hope in Homer's paintings, and it would seem, at least for me, in my reading of Lewis so far, it would seem that naturalism wants to free us from something beyond nature, because that thing beyond nature would then, out of necessity or perhaps follow logically, would have sovereignty over us who live inside nature. But in freeing us from the transcendent, from something beyond nature, the parallel action taking place is that we are also being, how should I say this? We are also being discouraged, if you will, or perhaps our ability to have hope is also lessened. Hope belongs in that sphere beyond nature, if you will. So if we're going to focus on a naturalistic state of existence where we only focus on space and time in this hermetically sealed process called nature, we have to, in a way, make a concession. We have to somehow surrender that sense, that youthful sense from this painting of hope. Before I get any further, I'd just like to ask a question, perhaps a little bit of Socratic in this. What do you understand hope to be? How do you understand this concept?
Here's a very basic idea. Maybe this, if you have the sense that something good might happen, even though you thought it was unlikely before.
Okay. The sense that something good might happen that in probability may not happen, may not have happened before, but may happen now.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Anybody else?
I was going to suggest that it's maybe a little simpler, and that is there's a reason to keep going.
A reason to keep going.
Yeah, there's no
Okay.
reason to quit. There's a reason, there's a purpose. There's also, I think it suggests purpose as well, by the way.
Okay. So we can pursue our efforts in order to attain some sort of goal, and it might bear fruit in the end, in that sense. Okay.
Yeah, I was
Oh,
thinking
go
when,
ahead.
as we're talking about if there is this transcendent being, we have less hope.
Mhm.
The sense that I was trying to make out of that is, for the definition of hope, is if there is this transcendent being, we don't have as much agency, and therefore we don't have as much hope because we can't affect the outcome.
So having a transcendent being may, for the naturalist minded, mean a diminishing of agency. So hope is having less agency?
No, she means the opposite.
Oh, go
No,
ahead. Right.
the other way.
The other way.
Hope is having agency.
Yes. Okay.
So if there's a transcendent being, then we have less hope because we have less agency. That being can override whatever it is we want.
Very good.
I'm confused because I thought I just heard a minute ago that the mindset of a naturalist is that free will does not exist.
Mhm.
Well, if you don't have free will, you don't have any agency either, or rather.
Very much so.
Is it okay to be confused?
Well, it's perfectly okay. Remember, Lewis says that the only thing that reserves the right to a free will is the process itself. It's not those things that live within the process. The sense of a little bit of befuddlement and confusion is why we have this real dilemma with Lewis's and his two definitions, yes? Not with him, but especially when he talks about the naturalist minded. On one hand, we want to be free from a transcendent being. But at the same time, we are being dominated, if you will, by the process, by nature. How much agency should be involved in hope?
I was going to say earlier, a
Mhm.
two-word definition of hope would be a positive, I guess it's three words, a positive expectation. So, you know, a little baby, toddler or older will have
Yes,
positive expectations based on previous performance of the parent.
right.
He or she doesn't really have to contribute very much, apart from maybe crying about being hungry or something.
Right. Okay. Just a side note, and perhaps this capacity of human agency within hope. Um, Another former mentor of mine, he's now passed as well. He used to teach at Georgetown for a very long time. Father James Shull. He was professor of government at Georgetown a long time ago. We were talking about Stoicism one day. We were having a discussion on Stoic philosophy. Marcus Aurelius. Stoicism, of course, as you guys know, is the sense that the philosophical school in ancient Greece and Rome, wherein we make ourselves so strong that we are able to weather the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, whatever life can throw at us, and still be strong and still be unmoved by all of that. Yes. I was expressing to my friend and mentor that I admired Marcus Aurelius' Stoic philosophy, to which his response was very interesting. He said, "You have to be really careful, Jose. Stoicism is always the gateway to pride." It was a head scratcher when I first heard it, because I had very positive views of Stoicism, of course. You had to be a strong person. You had to be able to withstand rather adverse situations in life. But how does that exactly lead you to pride? We'll think of it this way. It actually took me a few months to figure out. When you are a Stoic, you say, I don't need anybody. I don't need anyone. I can do this all myself. When you begin doing that, you begin canceling out other people, other beings, whether here or transcendent from your life. You begin closing yourself off, so to speak, not being open to something else that may help, not being open to hope. If you adopt a Stoic mindset, and by the way, Stoicism was very popular in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, especially during the Hellenistic age of Greek and Roman history, well, mostly Greek history. This sense that I can withstand all of these things if I just made myself very, very strong. But the problem is that you really isolate yourself from other people, and also whichever divine beings may be there to help you out. You cancel out any possibility of hope because you say, I am completely self-sufficient. I have no need of anything else. Okay. Now, second portion of the reading, we're transitioning now. I'll provide the visual in a little bit to our second quote. This is found on pages 45 to 46. And again, our topics for this particular portion is, now that we've looked at a dilemma that happens with naturalistic thinking, Lewis will then say, well, what if we entertain the possibility of naturalism having its own faith, having its own religion, so to speak? So this begins at the end of page 45, last paragraph, end of page 45. At this point, it is tempting to try whether naturalism cannot still be saved. I pointed out in chapter 2 that one could remain a naturalist and yet believe in a certain kind of God, a cosmic consciousness to which the whole show somehow gave rise what we might call an emergent God. Would not an emergent God give us all we need? Is it really necessary to bring in a supernatural God, distinct from and outside the whole interlocked system? Notice, modern reader, how your spirits rise, how much more at home you would feel with an emergent rather than with a transcendent God. How much less primitive, repugnant, and naive the emergent conception seems to you. For by that, as you will see later, there hangs a tale. Next paragraph on page 46, but I'm afraid it will not do. It is, of course, possible to suppose that when all the atoms of the universe got into a certain relation, which they were bound to get into sooner or later, they would give rise to a universal consciousness. And it might have thoughts. It might cause those thoughts to pass through our minds. But unfortunately, its own thoughts on this supposition would be the product, of non-rational causes,
Mhm.
and therefore, by the rule which we use daily, they would have no validity. This cosmic mind would be, just as much as our own minds, the product of mindless nature. We have not escaped from that difficulty. We have only put it a stage further back. Key line here: the cosmic mind will help us only if we put it at the beginning, if we suppose it to be not the product of the total system, but the basic, original, self-existent fact, which exists in its own right. Lewis posits the possibility of a God of naturalism, an emergent God, something that comes to be a little bit later, that is in the process of being made, so to speak, or cosmic consciousness. This manner of God is not beyond nature. Remember again, it is within nature, and comes about via the process of nature. Lewis alludes to this being a more comfortable and advanced counterpart to a transcendent God. I'd like to dwell on this for a second, why this would be more comfortable. If you've read Chesterton before, Chesterton makes the case, I believe it's in Orthodoxy, I could be mistaken, or it could be The Everlasting Man. Chesterton makes the case that nature cannot be called mother or father, because nature, like us, needed to be caused. It did not cause itself to be. Nature, according to Chesterton, is a sibling rather than a parent. Why would a sibling kind of divinity, what he's talking about, what Lewis is talking about here, yes? Why would an emergent God of nature, which comes about at the end of a process, that, like us, lives within nature, why would that be more comfortable?
I can't help thinking of the whole mythology of Star Wars, where you have this impersonal force that can be used for either good or evil. So it's very comfortable in the sense that you can manipulate it to your own ends without any moral expectation upon you, apparently. I'm not an expert on the Star Wars theology, mind you, or philosophy.
Yeah, I'm not an expert as well. So with regard to what you're talking about, the force in Star Wars, is it within nature? It's not beyond it. It's not something transcendent.
Force in Star Wars is it within nature?
It's within nature. Is it something that actively works through nature?
Does it work or is it worked?
No, does it work? Does it have agency?
No, I'm just adding the question.
Right.
Does it?
To Paul, it's Paul.
Does it work? Yes. Does it work?
Yeah, does it actively work or is it just?
I would say
work?
the fact that, Anakin was prophesied, is it working?
Okay.
So it has some amount of agency.
Yeah, some amount, but it's very small.
Right.
This thing about that nature is comfortable in a sibling, it strikes me or reminds me of the later chapter where he's talking about how pantheism pops up throughout history philosophically, and that it's actually the more, call it it's a kind of a default state that humans fall into. Yeah.
I don't want to give too much away for next presentation, but there's a whole block on pantheism for next in 2 weeks. So it's a very interesting topic, but we've reserved it for the latter part of the presentation. A very good point. Why do you think Lewis would call this more comfortable?
I don't think he's saying that he's more comfortable with it. I think he's saying that people with the prejudices and presumptions of the mid-20th century are more comfortable with it.
Yes, but why?
Because it takes away the threat of an outside accountability.
So I was expecting him to say that. I don't remember him saying it though.
Okay, maybe he didn't. Maybe I'm just saying.
I was expecting to hear that. I mean, don't remember hearing it, but maybe I didn't. That I don't remember every word either.
There's a lack of outside accountability if it's a sibling. If nature is a God that is more of a sibling to us in that sense. Am I correct? One perhaps guess or a hypothesis perhaps would be we are more comfortable with emergent gods within nature who are more our siblings than our parents. Well, to put it in a very plain and everyday sort of manner, our siblings can tell us to make our bed, or they're not going to ground us if we don't make it. The parent has sovereignty in that sense. It is beyond nature and can give certain instructions which we perhaps feel compelled to follow in that sense. Lewison points out there is a flaw in this kind of thinking, however, of an emergent God. The flaw is that the assumed advanced thoughts of the emergent God would have to evolve from chaos into order, from non-rational nature into advanced divinity. How valid would then these thoughts be if they were once at a certain point chaotic and disorganized? The cosmic mind, according to Lewis, only is beneficial if it comes first. Aquinas would, of course, add to this. Thomas Aquinas would say, not only comes first, but comes first and forever. It's always basically existing at the same time. That's proof number 3 of the existence of God based on contingency. The cosmic mind is only beneficial if it comes first, not the result of a process, but rather self-existing truth. This would then point to a transcendent God beyond nature, a supernatural one. Our second visual for today. If you're local in San Francisco or around San Francisco, this is found at the Legion of Honor Museum. It is a very favorite place for my family. In fact, when my kids when my kids know it's close to Father's Day, they almost by default setting know we're probably going to the Legion. It's just one of those things within the Yulo family, the Yulo household. This painting is called The Holy Family. It was painted in 1620 by a Flemish artist, Jacob Jordaens, who lived from 1593 to 1678. So this is a later Baroque era painting. Jordaens was a student of Peter Paul Rubens, along with Van Dyck, who of course studied under Rubens as well. Though he outlived both by decades, he was a very long-lived artist, was Jordaens. And he inherited, perhaps his teacher, Rubens's admiration of Caravaggio's realism. Caravaggio is a great Italian painter, by the way, who captures in the height of the Baroque period, paintings that are so realistic that they almost look like pictures of live people in them. That said, Jordaens has a different point of emphasis of his realism differing from Rubens and Van Dyck's own interpretations. I picked this up from an online lecture given by a Belgian art historian, Joost van der Auwera. He was lecturing at the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. He's an expert on Jordaens, and he says that Jordaens' focus is different from Van Dyck and Rubens because Van Dyck and Rubens focus on portraying their subjects in a noble manner, in a way to convey nobility. In a way, John Singer Sargent had that as well, I mentioned earlier. But instead, Jordaens portrayed everyday people and everyday life, neither better or worse, but simply as they were, a bourgeois public, so to speak. The focus on the everyday may have been purposed by Jordaens to be different from both Rubens and Van Dyck, who were both Catholic, by the way. Jordaens was a Protestant. Jordaens was a Protestant and focused on the everyday. However, his focus on the everyday does not take away or is not a departure from supernaturalism. So let's see a little bit where we can find the supernatural in a very realist form of painting. If we look at the painting, Saints Joseph and Anne, you can see they're both older. Joseph's hair has not turned gray yet, but you can see the lines on his face. He's an older man. The way that Jordaens depicts Mary is rather interesting. She is a lot younger than Joseph. She is looking directly at us, along with Jesus, of course, from the painting. Telltale signs, perhaps. She looks like, when I saw this painting, and I've seen it many times in many visits to the museum, she looks like a mom who's working very hard to take care of her kid. Where do we see this? This wisp of hair. Her hair is not perfect. It's not all, it has a good hairdo for that day. It shows perhaps that she's been working very, very hard in this job that she has in taking care of the Christ child, of bearing Jesus. And she looks also, by the way, even though she's very young, the look she gives us from the painting, this is a person very mature beyond her years. focusing on the angel here on the upper right-hand corner. My wife Joyce made a comment to me that if you look at the angel, you wouldn't know, except for the wings, that this was an angel. The realist manner in which Jordaens painted, he made the angel, at least to me, look very approachable. This is somebody you would perhaps find in a Renaissance era or Baroque era market. The eyes, the nose, and the chin, and the face. What strikes me is almost a little bit of 5 o'clock shadow, uniquely enough, with the angel. Something you don't expect with works that convey greater nobility with angels and divine beings. If we look at the baby Jesus, interesting thing, very cherubic, of course, very chubby, very cute, but his face isn't that symmetrical, i.e., there's a little bit more of cheek over here than he does have on the left-hand side. This reminded me, if you've seen the Byzantine work of art, Christos Pantokrator, that is a picture of Jesus at St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt, where you have the full sort of frontal portrayal of Jesus, but he's almost split down the middle, where one side of his face is almost looking in a different direction than the one side of his face, conveying, of course, this sense of man and God at the same time. I don't know, it just came to my mind when I was looking at the asymmetry of the baby Jesus's face. There are 3 objects in the painting that point to supernaturalism. While this painting is very, very realistic in its portrayal of people, what they look like, there is a very strong element of supernaturalism here. And I would argue this supernaturalism points to a sense of hope. And this is tied to a supernatural God, not an emergent God, as described by Lewis a little bit earlier. So what are these objects? If we look over here, being held by the angel, these are grapes. These are grapes evoking or bringing into mind the image of the blood sacrifice of Jesus. Very unique to this, I'm currently teaching a Western civilization class. We are in the early to mid Roman Christianity period. And one of the interesting data points that we cover is that why Christianity was so attractive to people in its early stages is that when compared to other faiths, your initiation in Christianity was by water, was through baptism. The initiation into other faiths, many other faiths during that time, and many hundreds of years before the time of Christ, were done through blood. There was a sacrifice of animals, the use of blood, the reading of entrails by soothsayers. This was the one faith where it said that your blood is not required. There's not going to be any human sacrifices in this new faith. In fact, this God is going to be the sacrifice, is himself going to sacrifice for you. If we look above the head of Jesus, we find a wreath. This first struck me as a bit strange, because a wreath on the head carries with it a very evocative pagan imagery. I believe I covered Caravaggio's painting of Dionysus or Bacchus last year with Mere Christianity. That's the god of wine of Greece, and he has that garland over his head of flowers. It does evoke that, but the way that Jordaens paints this, he is not saying this baby here is another version of Dionysus. He is saying this garland over his head will eventually be his crown of thorns, of his eventual later suffering, as a sacrifice, as depicted by the grapes for us. It's a prophetic symbol, in a way, that was meant to mock. The crown, of course, the crown of thorns, of course, yes, is meant as a sign of mockery and pain. But the crown could not mask, even the crown of mockery, the crown of thorns, could not mask the true kingship of this child. That this is something else. This is not just some pagan divinity of nature. This is something beyond nature. Last of these articles or objects is held in the hands of the Christ child. And this, of course, is a rosary. A rosary is a prayer that is meditative and where you repeat a prayer over and over again. I went to all boys Catholic school in the Philippines. This is something we did a long time ago. I still do this today. The second portion of the Hail Mary prayer, which you say when you're saying the rosary, is rather telling. It goes, Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. There is the admission in this prayer that we are not perfect, that we ask for the intercession of the Virgin Mary for us to please put in a good word for us. If you could, if you have the time, hopefully, please help us out a little bit. Why? We can't do this all ourselves. Think of Stoicism. We can't be virtuous enough to get to heaven. It doesn't work that way. We can never really repay that original aboriginal sin of Adam. What we can do is work as hard as we can, do the best we can, but leave a little bit of room for something called hope. Be open to something that can be an extra bit amount of help to you. Realize that you have strength, you have ability, we have intellect, and all of these things can get you places. But there's a certain point at which all of these things can't get us through the finish line, so to speak. And we are humble enough to ask for some sort of intercession. We are humble enough to be open to hope. Any other elements that you see in this painting that you may find interesting?
Question,
Sure.
why would a Protestant artist depict a rosary?
Jordaens was living in a place that I believe at the time was still Catholic. So he was courting an audience or a public that was not only of his own denomination. Questions on the painting itself? Anything you found?
Well, I'm
So-
trying to sort out who belongs to which hands.
Okay. Right.
So the angel, one of the angel's hands is holding the grace, but then there's a large hand next to that, and then there's another hand on someone's knee.
I think the large
Right.
hand, Anna.
Okay. This is the Virgin Mary's hand, I believe, right here. This is Saint Anne's hand, her mother. And this is the hand of the angel.
Jose, I had a thought about the painting. When I looked at this angel, as you said, he's very approachable and natural looking. He also looks very interested and eager and curious, yes. And it made me think of that passage in First Peter, this is 1:12, speaking of the life of the gospel, which things the angels desire to look into. Which we've received, but the angels desire to look into these things. And desiring to look into these things.
Yeah.
And I just
very
bet
That's a really good.
I bet the artist knew that verse.
Yeah.
Very good. What do you think about us would the angel be interested in looking into?
Well, how could God be man? How could there be this intimacy with God when it's just a baby? It's so
Right.
curious.
The angels being pure spirit, seeing God take the time to create, to essentially cause into existence man and God at the same time, something
Right.
in nature that also belongs beyond it.
Mhm.
Very good. Tying this to what we read about the emergent God of the naturalists, according to Lewis. What is being, at least to me, communicated in this painting is that there has to have been a divine or cosmic will already in existence. The things you're seeing, the garland on the head, the grapes, those things have not happened yet, though they are not emerging at the result of some process. They were there already as the plan of God the Father to say this is necessary for the salvation of humanity. So the divine or cosmic mind had to have been already in existence, was not something developing into existence as the God of the naturalists or the emergent God would have it. Make sense so far?
Jose, in addition, this painting portrays a threat to the emergent theory in the sense that the baby obviously was recently born. All the light is focused on the baby's face. This is clearly an intervention from outside the closed system of natural causes.
Very much so. And of course, that would be disquieting for the naturalist thinker, because intervention from beyond nature would again introduce this concept of sovereignty. That there is something that we kind of answer to, as you mentioned earlier.
Coming back to the angel for just a moment.
Sure.
The angel gives me the impression that he's wanting to help as well.
Oh, okay. Help how though, in that sense?
I'm not sure. The hand the view. He
Yes.
seems very interested in, well, this has more or less been said before. He's very interested in what's going on.
Yes. He's not idly standing by. Very, very interesting point you made. Yes. The ancient divinities of the Greco-Roman pagans have to be courted. You need to court them with sacrifice, with certain acts, if they will even consider your prayer, if they will even consider your sacrifice to be worthy enough for them to give you a favor here and there. But here we have an angel, no sacrifice involved, but as you said, already willing to help. This sense of community, perhaps communion, this sense of togetherness that you don't have with the Greco-Roman gods who live on Olympus very far away and have to be bowed down to with many, many different sacrifices. A very different kind of theology that we're seeing in this painting. Excellent point.
Further observation here, which
Sure.
it appears that most of the figures are in rather rough dress, but Mary herself is in very elaborate dress. It looks like velvet, and she's on looks like a carved chair.
Mhm.
She seems to be exalted in some ways
Yes.
from that appearance, as opposed to how the other figures are dressed.
Great observation. If one looks at Byzantine art, the art of Constantinople, long before, of course, realism in the Baroque period, you often find the theme of Mary on a throne, of her sitting on this sort of wooden object or this construct. The colors are very telling, by the way. We've seen that. I've presented on this concept many times before. The blue and the red are very important. The blue, of course, is a symbolism of purity, the purity of the Virgin Mary, and the red is always symbolic of the passion of Christ, of the blood later on that will be sacrificed from He who is God and man at the same time for all of our sins. In that sense, it's a great observation. We begin with part 3 of the presentation, and we'll be focusing on moving from the intellectual dilemma of naturalism. We covered after that the emergent the possibility of an emergent religion within naturalism. This will be chapter 5, which is a further difficulty in naturalism. And in my copy of the book, it will be on page 57. Top of the page on page 57, beginning with "in real life." If you guys see that. In real life. It's like the sentence that begins the middle of that top line. In real life, when a man says, "I ought," we may reply, "Yes, you're right. That is what you ought to do." Or else, "No, I think you're mistaken." But in a world of naturalists, if naturalists really remembered their philosophy out of school, the only sensible reply would be, "Oh, are you?" All moral judgments would be statements about the speaker's feelings, mistaken by him for statements about something else, the real moral quality of actions, which does not exist. Such a doctrine, I have admitted, is not flatly self-contradictory. The naturalist can, if he chooses, brazen it out. He can say, "Yes, I quite agree that there is no such thing as right and wrong. I admit that no moral judgment can be true or correct, and consequently, that no one system of morality can be better or worse than another. All ideas of good and evil are hallucinations, shadows cast on the outer world by the impulses which we may have been conditioned to feel." Indeed, many naturalists are delighted to say this. Small side note, the Enlightenment era thinker David Hume, by the way, this really got me thinking. This is almost exactly what Hume would have said. Last paragraph, but then they must stick to it. And fortunately, though inconsistently, most real naturalists do not. A moment after they have admitted that good and evil are illusions, you will find them exhorting us to work for posterity, to educate, revolutionize, liquidate, live and die for the good of the human race. Following from the naturalist worldview that downplays free will in order to tap into a more democratic structure, which is able to produce an emergent God, it's surprising to view moral judgments in this light. The claim of naturalists from Lewis is that moral judgments are mere statements about the speaker's feelings. One can ask if this is itself a statement of the naturalist's own feelings. Is this a naturalist's projection of what he or she may feel morality to be? Good and evil, then, are mere shapes that we have been programmed to experience. Lewis then points out that this renders naturalists' own moral judgments as being flawed. They cannot now establish moral imperatives. The natural question would be, well, it's good or bad according to what? What is the good of the human race if good itself does not exist?
Kind of ironic, the motto of the American Humanist Society is somewhat hubristic. We can be good without a God, without defining good, of course.
Has anybody posited the question, how is this possible? It could be a good Socratic question. Sharing now our third visual. The object you see in front of you is also found at the Legion of Honor Museum in San Francisco. It is called a chasse, French word, C-H-A, accent circonflexe, that's that little house roof symbol above the A, two S's and then an E. It was produced in Limoges, France, between the years 1200 and 1210. This casket, it's not that big actually, is called a reliquary. A reliquary in medieval times was where you put bones or relics or remains of a saint. The owner of the bones or the relics that were originally inside this chasse at the Legion of Honor in San Francisco have already been gone. They've gone a long time ago. We don't know which person they belong to at one point in time. However, what is notable is what is depicted on the outside of the chasse. We see a very telling scene, one of the more telling scenes in English history at that time. It is the scene of the killing of Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was assassinated, of course, on December 29 in 1170. Becket was an ambitious and successful clerk, British pronunciation, of the former Archbishop who was appointed Chancellor by his friend, King Henry II. He loyally served the king in this capacity, who thus moved Becket to the position of Archbishop. Henry II had plans to acquire more powers as a king, exercising more powers which would encroach on what had previously been ecclesiastical powers or powers of the church at the time. However, whereas Henry wanted a more compliant archbishop, for whatever reason, Thomas Becket, once he becomes Archbishop of Canterbury, he has a change of mind and heart, so to speak. He decides he will stand against Henry's ambitions, and for this, he will eventually be exiled to France in 1164. Upon his return from exile, Becket's one of his first actions when he comes back is he excommunicates the Archbishop of York. The Archbishop of York had been convinced by Henry II to preside over the coronation of Henry's son as co-ruler with Henry. By the way, the movie Becket has Richard Burton and Peter O'Toole, I believe, is playing Henry II. Henry has his great proclamation, or his great being very exasperated. Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest? Well, I guess when you're a king back in those days, people take what you say seriously. 4 of Henry's knights then travel to Canterbury Cathedral and assassinate Thomas Becket. If you've ever seen art that involves martyred saints in the past, I believe it's Saint Sebastian. If you see him portrayed, he usually has arrows stuck all over him because that's how he was killed. Saint Stephen, who was killed with Saul of Tarsus on the scene at that time, is usually depicted, if you see medieval art of Saint Stephen, with what look like 2 rocks stuck on his head because he was stoned to death. When you see a lot of art with Thomas Becket, you will usually see a sword close to or on his head because of the manner of his execution and his assassination. There was great outrage that followed the assassination of Thomas Becket. I believe that his assassins were sent to the Holy Land from which we never heard what happened to them again. The people of England at that time felt like an innocent man, a good man, had been unjustly killed at the behest or by the whims of a king. Very interesting thing that follows from this. Henry II submits himself to being flogged by the monks who were witness to the assassination. Henry says there's only one way I'm going to quiet these people is if I take some of this blame literally on my body as a corporal punishment. The tomb of Thomas Becket becomes a pilgrimage site. He is canonized as a saint a mere 3 years after his death, and his tomb becomes a very, very famous place people would go to. If I'm not mistaken, Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the Canterbury Tales are essentially people going to Canterbury as a form of pilgrimage. It was very difficult in the 12th century to go, of course, to the Holy Land. There were great conflicts fought during that time period, and the voyage itself was very, very difficult. So people who lived in what's now the UK would go over to, as a pilgrimage to Thomas Becket's grave. There were, at least from record, 703 documented miracles associated with traveling to Becket's tomb. Something rather interesting happens a couple of hundred years later. So Becket's death again in 1170. In the early to mid 1500s, when Henry VIII of England attempts to do more successfully what Henry II had tried to do several centuries before. By the way, small side note, yes, very odd that in the history of a place, you have two Henrys and two Thomases, so intrinsically connected. Henry II and Thomas Becket, Henry VIII and Thomas More. And in a very almost parallel situation, the king wants his friend called Thomas to go along with him. If you've watched A Man for All Seasons, this is brilliantly portrayed, of course, by Henry VIII. Robert Shaw is playing him, trying to convince Paul Schofield, who is Thomas More, to go along with basically agreeing to the marriage of Anne Boleyn. Both cases also, both Thomases end up dead. But what's interesting that happens with Henry VIII is when he takes over the churches. I'm not too sure if this happens. It probably happens after Thomas More is executed. When Henry goes about taking over the churches in England, he heads over to Canterbury Cathedral. He has Thomas Becket's grave exhumed. Becket's bones at Henry VIII's order are ground into powder and scattered to the four winds. Before we get any further, Henry VIII was a pretty lusty guy, a pretty willful guy. Why would you do this kind of thing? What would be the point to exhuming a corpse, destroying it further, and then dispersing it so none of it remains?
To prevent somebody from picking up a piece of bone and thinking it had spiritual power over you.
Or to prevent it becoming a place of pilgrimage.
Well, it already was, right? So he didn't want it to keep on being a pilgrimage place. In that case, yes, to stop it from being a pilgrimage place. Henry is going to be more powerful than Henry II had ever thought of being. He will now assume the title of head of the Church of England, of course. So why would you do this to what literally is a casket full of bones? There is a parallel, by the way, here and Henry II having himself flogged.
I mean, I thought there's some flawed theology in there, like why older generations of Christians valued burial over like cremation,
Right?
is the ease at which the resurrection can happen at the end of time.
Right.
And so maybe it was something about that, wanting to make sure that the resurrection wouldn't happen.
Oh, okay. So in a manner, Henry VIII is making it more difficult to for Thomas Becket to perhaps resurrect again. When Henry II accepts to being flogged by the monks who were there during the execution of Thomas Becket, he is acknowledging that Becket had the high ground, so to speak. He had a more moral position than Henry's own. The people were uprising against him, or at least were in the very least complaining very loudly at this savage act of assassination. So Henry says, to appease this, there is a standard of rightness and wrongness. I am seen right now to have transgressed, exceeded certain boundaries, so I'm allowing this to happen to me, even though I'm the king. He acknowledges that there is some kind of system of right and wrong that is beyond the king. Henry VIII, in grinding Becket's bones into dust and dispersing them, is making a similar admission. Why must this man disappear, every trace of him? Because if he stays, there is something beyond the king. There is something beyond the king anyway. But by this one gesture, Henry perhaps can cast some sort of illusion that the king is now more powerful than a system of right and wrong. The king, Henry VIII himself, dictates what is right and wrong. Rightness and wrongness are held within the kingship, so to speak, instead of being transcended. Nevertheless, there were people even on the continent of Europe who saw this as a rather severe action. Becket still is in our memory, of course. He's still talked about in those circles. And Henry, in a sense, by grinding those bones and dispersing them, he is trying to wish away, if you will, a reminder of what is good. But Henry's actions, no matter how severe or violent, can't really do that, because he himself has to expire. He is mortal like the rest of us. So he's in a way acknowledging that there is something beyond what he can, in his kingly power, do. Perhaps a sense of hope as well. The last portion of our presentation today will be a working definition of what a miracle is. This is found, I'll get the chapter in a second, once I get to the page. Uniquely enough, this definition from Lewis of what a miracle is found in the chapter called A Chapter of Red Herrings. This is found in my copy, page 72. We'll begin with second full paragraph, by the laws of nature. By the laws of nature, such a man means, I think, the observed course of nature. If he means anything more than that, he is not the plain man I take him but a philosophic naturalist, and will be dealt with in the next chapter. The man I have in view believes that mere experiences, and especially those artificially contrived experiences we call experiments, can tell us what regularly happens in nature. And he thinks that what we have discovered excludes the possibility of miracle. This is a confusion of the mind, according to Lewis. Next paragraph. Granted that miracles can occur, it is, of course, for experience to say whether one has done so on any given occasion. But mere experience, even if prolonged for 1,000,000 years, cannot tell us whether the thing is possible. Experiment finds out what regularly happens in nature, the norm or rule to which she works. Those who believe in miracles are not denying that there is such a norm or rule. They are only saying that it can be suspended. Lewis comes to a definition of a miracle. He posits that the stance of a man who is not necessarily a disbeliever in God will say that a miracle would be contrary to the laws of nature. But the laws of nature mean here observed courses of nature. Lewis states that experiences, and those artificially generated called experiments, can inform us as to what happens in nature regularly. But Lewis says that experience, even for 1,000,000 years, cannot form us as to the possibility of something occurring. Experiments discover rules. He believes in miracles. Believers in miracles are not denying these rules, but rather saying or maintaining that these rules at certain times can be suspended. Last visual of today. This is a painting called San Cristobal, or Saint Christopher. This is found, by the way, at the National Museum of the Philippines, the National Art Museum of the Philippines. And it is painted by a Filipino artist who lived between 1802 to 1885, called Mariano Asuncion Imolo. Ironically, I covered his brother Justiniano Asuncion y Molo last year with Mere Christianity. The Asuncion family was a very artistic one. Many brothers and sisters engaged in artistic expression during the middle to late part of the 19th century. And by the way, this is the Philippines when it was still governed by Spain, not yet American. The United States coming in 1898. Mariano Asuncion y Molo was a multimedia artist, and he excelled at the crafting of religious imagery onto ivory metals and working this into jewelry or rosaries. The clientele for his work was broad, and his common themes consisted of the Passion of Christ, images of the Virgin Mary, and miracles associated with the saints. This, of course, is a saint called Saint Christopher. The sources, by the way, of the story of Christopher go back quite a long ways. The earliest origins of the story are found in 6th century Greece. A more formal presentation of his life was chronicled in what's called the Golden Legend. This was written around the 13th century. Christopher was a 3rd century martyr. He died around 251 AD. Legend has it that he was born out of the intercession of the Virgin Mary, albeit from a pagan or heathen father. He was very large and strong as a young man, and he swore to serve the strongest and the bravest of all masters. An old hermit taught him, however, the faith of Christianity and baptized him. He was rather hard-headed, was Christopher. Even though baptized, he said he would not fast or pray, but with his great strength, he would help people cross a turbulent stream, helping them out, of course, across this turbulent stream. One day, a child, whom he was helping carry across the water, grew heavier and heavier every step that Christopher took. It felt to Christopher like he was carrying the weight of the whole world on his shoulders. The child then told Christopher that he was the creator and the redeemer of the world. And to convince Christopher, he told him to plant his walking staff on the shore across the river or across the stream, and from the ground, a fruit-bearing palm tree then sprang forth. This led to multiple conversions, this new faith of Christopher. He was rather effective as someone who would convert people. He was incarcerated by a local dignitary of the time because Christopher refused to denounce Christ. He also refused to sacrifice to the Greco-Roman pagan beliefs. They handled this in different ways, the hard-headedness of Christopher. One way was they sent in 2 prostitutes to convince Christopher to stray or go beyond his faith. What ended up happening was Christopher ended up converting the 2 prostitutes to Christianity. So a no-go with that. After a softer approach, they went to a harder approach. They tortured Christopher, and eventually, all the way into his death, eventually he was, at the end of his torture, beheaded. It is interesting when we think of what Christopher did in this account of the story. He bore the weight of the world on his shoulders, bearing the Christ child on his shoulders. But he also bore Christ all the way to his death. He would not renounce this new faith, no matter what was thrown at him. This makes me think a little bit, frankly, of Niccolo Machiavelli, who arguably is the first political scientist on record.
And satirist?
But he was also a satirist.
Oh, he was a satirist.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay.
Satire?
Machiavelli, in his writings, would not have the highest opinion on people. He would advise the prince that people are pretty base. They're pretty fickle. They can be changed and moved in different ways. Machiavelli, I believe, once said about people in general, que si basa sul popolo, si basa su fango. That means he who builds on the people builds on mud. People aren't that strong. They don't have great strength in reserve or character and can be molded according to the power of the prince. Now, with that in mind, we have to look at what Christopher did. Christopher withstood two things. He withstood the temptation of pleasure. Some could argue that's a rather very, very strong temptation to withstand. And then he withstood the punishment of fear and pain. According to Machiavelli, there are ways to make people change what they do, what they believe. But it would seem that these didn't work for Christopher, that he was stalwart, he was resolute in his beliefs. And even if the world had both pleasure or pain thrown at him, he wasn't moving from this new faith once he discovered what he now believed in. He went to his death, I would say, a rather hopeful person. He was converting people in his cell and not renouncing this newfound belief of his. It reminds me of a line from the Psalms. This, depending on the translation, is 90 or 91. From the Latin, non timebis a timore nocturno, a sagitta volante in die. You shall not fear the terrors of the night, or the arrow that flies by day. When I think of that line from the Psalms, it is a very hopeful one. It is one that says, I will be with you. I will not deny or ignore you or neglect you, as the Greco-Roman gods are very wont to do. They're very easily cast aside people who have believed in them for a very long time. No, this new faith will be right there with you, will suffer alongside you, and encourage this sense of openness and hope. Any questions you may have from the presentation today?
I come from the latter part of the book, but from a previous reading, but sound like it was said that this was a popular apologetics book, but sometimes it seems like he's writing for an academic audience where he will sort of posit different sides, where he sounds really iffy, like being uncertain about the resurrection and so forth. Is he writing for a popular audience or an academic thing?
To try to answer that, I go back to what I said initially at the beginning of the presentation. This is very different from Mere Christianity. I have to admit, I was much more challenged reading this than in reading Mere Christianity. In that, in Mere Christianity, he's writing as a professor who is giving you sort of clues to figure out a conclusion at the end. He's teaching you about humility. Essentially, you're learning about the opposite of pride in Mere Christianity. But in Miracles, he's not exactly giving you breadcrumbs to follow when you get to an easy conclusion. What he's kind of doing is he's teaching you, instead of saying what humility is as a definition, as what a professor would do on a blackboard. In writing Miracles, in a way, Lewis is trying to make you humble. Even the most academic of us, to realize that there are things beyond. That's the whole thing with hope, and standing against the pride that comes with Stoicism. There are things beyond our capacity. We can't make miracles happen. We can't order them a la carte or fixed price, however way you'd like. They can be prayed for, and when they do occur, we are very grateful for them occurring. But this is not something we could bottle or easily figure out.
Okay.
Other questions?
A really telling definition of hope is in the letter to the Hebrews in chapter 6, where it says that hope is the steadfast and sure anchor for the soul.
Yes. In a sense, it's also a form of trust. It's trusting that, I can't do this all by myself. I'm leaving this open. I'm leaving this for you in the form of prayer, perhaps, to please come in and help when you can, and being open to that. I think the key also is not expecting an instant return. God essentially will affect you in your life when He chooses, not on your schedule, which is why it's very difficult for us to sort of fathom or grasp, in a sense that Mere Christianity was a little bit more approachable. Any other questions or comments?
When I'm reading many of Lewis's other works, I'm struck by how he oftentimes draws very stark dichotomies
Mhm.
when he's explaining things, and he makes one side look completely ridiculous, and therefore you take the other side. And he is drawing a dichotomy here between naturalist thinking and supernaturalist thinking, but he comes around it from many different directions, explaining it in different ways. So I feel like he's much more thorough in miracles than he is in his other writing.
Thorough in that he's providing many different avenues to understanding.
Yes.
Okay.
Like
And
you
some
don't
of those, frankly,
get it the next time.
yeah. And frankly, some of those avenues are really challenge us intellectually to sort of grasp. Grasping hope, by the way, is a challenge in and of itself. It's not something easily assimilated or imagined. There is really an amount of trust there that has to be open to something beyond our skills, our intellect, or our strength to help us out when we do need it. Well, I look very much forward to sharing with you more readings from Lewis and new visuals next week, or I'm sorry, next 2 weeks for our meeting. It was great having you guys. Hope you guys have a good week, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you.